hell. So said United States Union Army leader General Sherman. That's as true today as it was when he said it in the 1870s. And yet, in the midst of carnage and destruction, we see examples of heroism, endurance, and ingenuity that go beyond the call of duty. In this series, we pay tribute to elite male and female soldiers whose bravery and discipline speaks to us over centuries. They lived by the sword, and they died by the sword. They followed the warrior's way. The shining suit of plate armor, carrying a jousting spear, wearing a brightly colored coat of arms. This was the popular idea of a medieval knight, but the original knights were stripped down, low-tech, and not interested in showing off. Such were the Knights Templar.
Actually, when we speak about knights as general, we need to consider a very large timeline, because we are talking about a certain kind of warriors that somehow emerged since, let's say, 9th century, early warriors on horseback, to late Middle Ages, like 15th century.
But starting from the 14th century and then moving on towards the 15th century, 16th century, actually you have the appearance of shining armors with iron plates. They could appear very beautiful, of course, shining under the sun.
Before there were knights in shining armor, there were knights in chainmail. Knights in plate armor would fight for honor, riches, love, or sport. But the Knights Templar were strictly God's warriors, forged out of the Crusades.
The enduring fascination of the Templars is something that we all have in our psyche. I think it's the notion that there are certain men devoted to cause and deity enough that they are soldiers of protection. They will fight till death to protect those who are weak and unable to defend themselves. And the Knights Templars are just part of that. The Shaolin priests that do it, it's the Tibetan monks, it's any type of soldier, warrior, religious person.
The Roman history was special because they grow, they develop from a very humble origin, into something great. Especially they managed to create and to develop a specific link with the Pope and then also with the King.
At the age of 21, French nobleman Jafroy de Champagne is already an experienced knight. To become a Templar, however, he must give up his family name and all his worldly possessions and pleasures of the flesh. His only relationship must be with God and his fellow Templars. From now on, he must avoid the company of women as much as possible, even if they're from his own family, including his own mother. Templar knights swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were part soldier and part monk. They made up one of the greatest bodies of fighting men in military history.
Temple Knights start out very humbly. So the Knights Templars and another group that was beginning at the same time, the Knights Hospitallers, both start out as helpmates for individuals, for the knights that are on crusade, the resident crusaders, to get them into care, to get them into old age care, or to get their wounds taken care of. Then they developed a military function after that, because that too became apparent. You need to be able to defend them, and they're getting older. So to recruit new ones in, the Knights Hospitallers, the Knights Templars both seem to grow in the defense and military aspects more than they do in just the hospitalization and taking care of the pilgrims.
It's hard for the modern mind to understand how men could live with such humility and simplicity, yet go into battle the way they did. The courage of the Templar Knights was legendary. They were renowned for never breaking ranks, even under the heaviest of assaults by archers, infantry, or cavalry. Their reward was in heaven. On the battlefield, the sight of the Templars' white mantles and red crosses would inspire their comrades and strike terror into the hearts of their enemies.
The Templar Knight would first position his spear. Then, together with his peers, to his right and left, they attack the enemy. When the group attack gave way to individual fighting, other weapons were used. The sword was the weapon of choice for close fighting. The knight, on horseback, used all the weight of his body to slash with his sword. And the cuts he inflicted were made with tremendous power, causing massive destruction. The mace was another weapon of choice, and it too was used for striking or cutting. Stabbing with the point of a sword was relatively ineffective because the defensive chainmail armor of the time was very good. Both Muslims and the Crusaders wore chainmail armor. So one could say stabbing was only used to finish the enemy after you compromised their position. The primary tactic was to slash and cut the individual in close combat after the initial attack.
Perhaps the Knights Templars' greatest patron was England's 12th century ruler, Crusader King Richard the Lionhearted. Richard's arch-enemy, Saladin, also had great respect for the Templars. Mutual respect for one's enemies was the warrior's way. Templars, their sergeants, and all their troops were expected to fight until the last man. They were expressly forbidden to retreat unless the odds against them were more than 3 to 1. Surrender was unheard of. They fought by their own code.
We don't know when the Templars and Hospitallers began to write their own rule. We don't have any of the Hospitaller rules existing, but we do have a couple of the Templar rules existing. And they are monastic orders rules. So rules to be a monk, how much to pray each day, how much to sleep each day, how much devotion they have to put in, what their restrictions are on food and so forth. And then we have for these very separate rules from monastic rules that are how to lead a charge, what to do with sergeant knights, what happens if a knight is drunk, what happens if a knight breaks charge, what happens if a knight is cowardly. These things that would not normally have played any role whatsoever in a monk's life in a knight's life are very, very important because that is now their new servitude. It's almost like, okay, well, you're a monk, you're celibate, you're obedient, you're honorable. Well, now you're also somebody who can fight against the Muslims.
Medieval cavalry depended on more than prayer books. Like any army, there were logistics. Knights on horseback were assisted by sergeants, infantry, and support units. Whether in day-to-day military life and in battle, the different sections worked together as one well-oiled unit.
The cavalry worked as a wedge, breaking the formation of the enemies. And then the infantry would follow, making the rest of the dirty job. So this was one of the nice elements in terms of how a battle was going on. No? First of all, you have also the archers working with their arrows. Of course, in order to create as many casualties as they could. Then the cavalry in a wedge formation broke the compact entity represented by the enemies. And then in the end, you have the infantrymen coming, joining, and making the rest of the dirty job with their sword and everything.
Like most noblemen of his age, Jafroy de Champagne would have been trained from boyhood to fight. From the first time he hears about the Templar, Jafroy is inspired to become one of these warriors of Christ. For the rest of his life, he will be a servant in the hands of his vengeful God. But his first days in the Templar Order are even more humbling than Geofroi had expected.
It might not happen actually that all noblemen were rich. It happened especially to the sons that were not being the firstborn sons, so they were not really having the luxury to get the land or get the servants or to be able to serve, to have actual money. So all younger sons, which were also noblemen, they were supposed to look their own way of life.
The Knights Templar needed to keep their life holy and simple. They needed to be humble. They could not really possess any riches. They needed to have a simple monastic spiritual kind of life. So they were called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. This really identifies one of the main traits of these knights. They needed to be poor, they needed to be humble, they needed to fight, and to fight for Christ.
Most Knights Templar took vows of celibacy. However, as there was a high demand for knights, it was possible to join the order for a set period of service before returning to civilian life. There were also the Fratres Conjugati, who were Templars permitted to marry. These Templars wore a black or brown mantle with a red cross to distinguish them from the celibate lifetime members. You can see this from the seal of the Templars, which depicted two knights sharing the same horse. The Templar Knights were proud of their austerity and self-denial.
They lived a life completely entrenched in religious activities, in religious emotions as well. It was a very important context for them. So religion was just central in the Middle Ages, as I can say this, as economy is central for us today. So religion was so much also connected to economy, to economical activities, to politics. So everything spoke about religion.
When they're appointing or when they're making religious individuals like the Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar, They too were fanatics. They were a little bit more moderate in their religious showmanship, but they were fanatics, and they believed very firmly in their role. These were not just knights, or not just knights of the Temple Mount. These were knights of God. They were knights of Christ in the Holy Land. They were the defenders of the Holy Land.
When a young warrior monk is admitted into the Templar order, it is a ceremony with mythical qualities. For the novitiates, like Jafroy de Champagne, it is the culmination of a dream that started when he was 7, beginning his long apprenticeship to knighthood by serving as a page boy.
A moment in which an individual became a Knight Templar was a very important one. That was the most important moment in his whole life, I would say. So it was both a religious and a military kind of ceremony, but it was a very simple ceremony, I would say, in the medieval times. Very similar also to what you would have in other knightly contexts. It was very special and specific ritual organized for that purpose, generally in one of the houses of the Order of the Temple. Generally in a church, I would say, because it was a religious kind of investiture as well. So the Grand Master would invest the knight of his own specific role and task. So on that occasion, you, as a Knight Templar, would be provided with your white vest. You would be granted the right to be called a Knight Templar.
There are dark tales about what went on in Templar initiation ceremonies. But now, there's no mistaking Geoffroy de Champagne for a page boy. He's a soldier of God at last. There is still one more mountain to climb after his initiation into the Templar Order, and that is to fight in battle with his brother knights and earn the right to wear the red cross on his cloak.
So the Knights Templar had to take their vows, their religious vows, as any other religious in the Middle Ages. So they needed to take the 3 general religious vows, to which a 4th one was added: poverty, chastity, obedience. To this, a 4th, more specific vows was added, and that was concerning their military activity.
Some of the conditions set down in the so-called Latin Rule, the Templar Rule Book, must have subjected Geoffroy to a pretty harsh life.
Well, the Latin rule was partially based on the Benedictine rules, so the rule of the Benedictine monks. Also, they could not receive any gift or a letter without letting the master know about it. And surely, for example, obedience to the master, first of all, was fundamental to build up community spirit.
The Templar Knights were even required to share their food bowl with a brother knight.
One of the more interesting things about the rule is that they were supposed to eat together, 2 of them from the same bowl, but it's not because they were controlling that they will eat too much. It's opposite, that they were trying to eat too less, to be too humble to God.
It is rather fun when you start reading these different rules and you read the stuff on there that is from the monastic orders, and it says, oh, you can't drink this much, you have to drink this much, you have to eat fish on Friday, you have to do all this other stuff, and that's just pretty normal. And then you all of a sudden run into a section, how to charge. Well, that's not in a normal monastic book. How to charge, so you then have to read. This is how you mount your horse, this is how you get your horse ready, this is how you listen to your commander, this is how you move out, keep the horses in line, and so forth. None of that, of course, would be in the monastic book. There's no reason for it, but it's all there for them. And that specialness, you realize you've crossed the border between a monastic order and a monastic military order.
Knights would generally be in the service of a baron or lord who would provide them land grants in return for their lethal services. Many such cavalry from the 9th century on served under Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, with a sworn mission to protect Christendom against the Moors and the Byzantines.
The first orders were connected with the Holy Land, the creation of the kingdoms to protect the pilgrims, and actually the creation of these orders changed a little bit, you can say, the game, because usually that was like the knights were serving their lord, they were serving him in the military way, among other ways, but they were supposed to give him help when they are called. The creation of orders, military orders at the Holy Land, it happened that instantly in the Holy Land there were specially trained forces, knights who were in the service of God, and they were fighting all the time, they were prepared to fight all the time.
The Templars represented a significant unification between spirituality and military dedication. These were true soldiers of God, and in their ethos, their tactics, and their military precision and dedication, they represented a significant progression from what had gone before.
For a given example, we've got an idea pretty much of what the First Crusaders wore because it's on the Bayeux Tapestry. Not at all about the First Crusade, but about Norman conquest of England. They're wearing the same type of outfits that they would have worn 20 years later, 30 years later, to go on the Crusades. Same type of nasal helmets, the same type of mail shirt that only went down towards to cover about half the arms, a kite shield, and a sword and a spear. That would have been probably it. Sometimes they would have had mail leggings that were attached. They became more and more popular. That's what the army looked like as they went out. Now, somewhere within the first century, that changed. The armor became longer. It started to cover the body. Still mail. It covers the hands. Still mail. And it covers the back of the head. The helmet doesn't change till around 1200. Then it becomes more what we call the great helm that'll completely encase the head, which the nasal helmet did not. The shields become shorter, smaller, and so forth. All those changes were happening. By the end of the Crusades, 1291, say, the fall of the Latin kingdoms and in the Holy Land, those outfits are still state-of-the-art, but they're probably not what they could have gotten in Italy at that time.
From the point of view of their weapons, I think that the most formidable weapon of the Knights Templar was their bravery. So they were brave, and above all, they were not scared about the idea of dying during the battle. So that was the most important weapon they had, because there was also this important call towards martyrdom, so towards becoming martyrs for God, for the sake of God, for the sake of their faith. So I would really say that also from the military point of view, this feeling that they had constituted the most important kind of weapon. And sometimes their enemies also were frightened because of this.
Medieval cavalry depended on more than courage and prayer books. Knights such as Jafroy are assisted by an army of sergeants, infantry, and other support. He will go into battle knowing all his weapons and kit are the best possible. The Templars set the bar high for all the knights that came after them. For years, archaeologists continue to find samples of chainmail armor.
As an archaeologist, we are quite often finding such pieces during the excavations, not full chainmail armor, but parts of it. But in museums, there are many of them still surviving to this day. And they were not as heavy as we imagine. Like the whole armor that was covering the knees might be weighing around 8 to 10 kilograms. So it was not so much heavy. Also the swords, they were not as heavy as we imagined they were. They need to fence them, so the sword could weigh like 1 kilogram probably. So it's manageable thing, even compared to younger sabers. They were quite similar weight, so it was possible to fight them easily. But still, fighting on the horseback requires a lot of skill and a lot of practice.
The romantic idea of a knight was that he had an almost mythic connection with his sword, something he would never give up on pain of death.
We have these notions of mystical swords that are really good. Of course, we've got Excalibur, we have Durandal, we have these swords that are named, but very few King Arthur and Count Roland swords are floating around like this. The Knights Templars probably had theirs. We don't have any single Knights Templar sword that is associated with any single knight himself. They definitely had a sword. What happened if that sword was lost in a battle? They got another sword.
I think that it's mostly a romantic way of perceiving a knight with their own trusted sword. Of course, there were famous swords, or magical swords in the way. Some of them are known to this day, like Durandal, the sword of Roland, for instance, or swords with names. Some swords have some inscriptions on them, some magic formulas, or they were related to courtly love or to other things. But for most people who were fighting, the sword was a tool of trade, so they were especially using it to fight.
In addition to swords, knights also carried lances, spears, daggers, maces, and even heavy wooden clubs. How were these various weapons deployed during battle?
Medieval knights. Their first assault weapon was a spear, because the purpose of the armored cavalry was simply to attack and literally hit the enemy's ranks. Thus, the spear was the first weapon of choice. After that, during individual fighting, knights used the sword, but also other weapons, such as the mace or even a dagger, especially if your man was on the ground. But definitely the most important weapons were the spear and the sword. We speak about the uniformity of equipment used by orders such as the Templars. We suppose that the Templars had organized the mass purchase of equipment. So the Templar Knights usually had a complete set of equipment purchased by their order.
Knights in plate armor are obviously from a later time. The armor of the 9th to 12th century Crusades was mostly chainmail, which of course is what Jafroy is wearing.
Mail is the greatest armor ever produced, in my estimation. It is far better than plate, because it's a lot less expensive, and certainly far better than the bronze breastplates that the Romans had or so forth. But it is expensive. You put it together, there's rings that get put together, sometimes 70,000 to 100,000 rings to cover a body. You could take a mailed body, move that body as he would be in a battle, back and forth and swinging his sword and so forth, and that mail ripples across the body. Nothing penetrates it.
As well as his chainmail, the mounted knight like Jafroy would carry a shield for protection, but also as a weapon, to aim at the faces of their enemies.
Knights always carried shields, we do know this. But it's a strange notion as to how they actually used them. In tournaments and so forth, we know that they were mostly targets for the opposing side to make sure that he didn't hit a vulnerable spot on his opponent in a tournament. But how would they be used in combat? It's really a curious thing, and I've seen reenactors try to fight with them. They're pretty unwieldy.
Skill in horsemanship was vital for maneuverability and angle of attack in battle.
Of course, if you are a knight, you need a horse. You are a knight because you have a horse, you know how to mount a horse, and you know how to fight horseback. This said, is important for the knight, it's important for a knight to have more than one horse, because a horse can get sick, can get stabbed during the battle, of course, so you need to have substitution. So at least you need to have 3 horses, if not more.
There's an old saying, you can still make a rider at puberty. After that, never. Jafroy would have been riding long before puberty. Templar knights, like all other knights, spent a great deal of their waking hours on horseback.
A war horse would have been a horse that could have carried a knight for a long period of time, that was strong, that would withstand wounds. I mean, the perfect example, of course, is Bucephalus, who carries Alexander the Great for, what, about 15 years, 21 years? Something that's extraordinary, and only dies at the last battle that Alexander is in. These type of horses go unnamed in the Middle Ages, but they were there. They needed to be well fed, they needed to be well watered, and they needed to be well cared for.
For hundreds of years, the Knights Templar deployed the same devastating tactics in battle, beginning with a cavalry charge. A classic medieval charge consisted of squadrons of 25 to 50 men charging side by side in a single line. They were so close to each other, they were almost knee to knee. They began the charge at a slow trot with their lances couched. Then, as they gathered pace, they would raise their lances. At the last minute, they would lower their lances and break into a gallop. This tactic prevented them from tiring the horses or losing formation, breaking ranks.
Well-used attack cavalry can be absolutely stunning, and this is a thing that we are also, as a modern people, a little bit not used to. We rarely see humans on horses in towns or in everyday life, but the sight of a running horse in a full gallop, warrior with a spear or lance or even a sword charging is really terrifying. It's a thing that can make you run.
On their huge war horses, they would charge headlong at the enemy, the earth below rumbling under their weight. They brought tremendous psychological shock and awe to the battlefield. When on the move and in action, they were both the special forces and elite mobile heavy cavalry units of their day. A good comparison today might be a US M1 Abrams tank unit. Fast and almost impervious to battlefield assault. In the late 12th century, Geofroi de Champagne, on horseback, made his way from Western Europe to the Middle East and the Holy Land. The rest of his whole relatively short life was out in front of him. A young knight joining the Templars in the Holy Land had to live up to impossibly high standards. The Templars' headquarters in Jerusalem was on Temple Mount, or Haram es-Sharif. Today, as then, it is a holy site for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. In the Middle Ages, it was believed this is where the Temple of Solomon once stood. To this day, some believe there is an underground crypt where the Templar Knights kept priceless religious relics, like the Shroud of Jesus, the head of John the Baptist, the Ark of the Covenant, and even the Holy Grail. But most bona fide historians are more skeptical.
In fact, we know what their best relic was. This was, in fact, the hand cloth that was the white Christ's face. That was the one that they considered to be their greatest relic.
The connection, the link between the Templars and the Holy Grail is pretty much a myth. But it's not really a myth entrenched in pure fantasy. Wolfram von Eschenbach says that the Holy Grail was guarded and protected by these knights that can recall the idea of the Templars.
The Order of the Templars was formed in 1119 after the First Crusade to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. And like all crusaders, the Templar Knights believed they were fighting for a holy cause. To absolve their sins, men were willing to take up arms to defend the Holy Land, free the Eastern churches, and drive the Moors from Spain.
All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God, from which I am invested. Let those who for a long time have been robbers now become knights. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians.
So it was the year 1095 when Pope Urban II decided to give the famous speech at Clermont during the council in order to call all the Christians for this important enterprise, retake, recapture, reconquer Jerusalem from the hands of the infidels.
In its heyday, the Templar army would have been made up of as many as 160,000 Templar infantry and support staff, all assisting, in their way, the 20,000 knights in armor on the field.
I don't think the Byzantines expected many more than maybe a couple hundred, maybe 1,000. 100,000 soldiers and people, peasants, all go on that first crusade. It must have been an amazing sight to see. Unfortunately, the first 35,000 or so aren't soldiers at all. They're peasants. They've gone on their own to this crusade. They've answered what Urban was requesting, but not in the spirit that Urban was requesting. He wanted soldiers. They show up, Byzantines take them across the Bosphorus, and they're killed almost immediately or made slaves. Then the knights show up, 75,000, 60 to 75,000. And these are also far more extensive than the Byzantine Empire could ever have. But they're the ones who will go all the way to Jerusalem. And while they're there, their size will diminish at the very end to about 5,000. Consequently, there's a need for recruitment. This is the origin of the medieval monastic military unit.
Certainly, by the 13th century, the Templar Order had at its disposal numerous castles and ships, and thousands of fighting men. In the Holy Land alone, the Templars built and defended the fortress at Tortosa, or Tartus, in Syria. They also built the castle and a massive underground network at Acre, now Akko, in Israel. These Templar castles were part of a network of crusader fortifications, such as Chastel Blanc and Chastel Rouge, and the massive Croix des Chevaliers, the Knights' Hospitalier Castle, with walls 100 feet thick. These magnificent fortresses were built from the blood and bone of war. The Templars were such effective warriors that just a few hundred of them could make all the difference to the outcome of a battle. One such example occurred at the Battle of Montchesart in 1177.
We are in 1177, and so this is the time for one of the major battles and one of the major victories of the Templars to happen. There are two different armies confronting each other, the huge army of Saladin, the Muslims, and the very small army of the Christians of Jerusalem under the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, the leper king. So a few hundreds of Christian knights, out of which just 80 were the Templars, attempted and in the end managed to beat the formidable huge army of Saladin.
Just 500 Templar knights and a few thousand infantry remarkably resisted the 26,000-strong army of Saladin. The defending Crusader army was led by the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, who at the time was only 16 years old and suffering from leprosy. Yet this very ill young man took Saladin by surprise at Montchesart. He waited until Saladin's forces were in a vulnerable position crossing a river, and then ordered an all-out attack. It was a military masterstroke that only delayed the inevitable. Saladin's forces were too great and too strong, and would ultimately retake Jerusalem.
Of course, the historians can argue if that was the exact number, but for sure the difference between the Knight Templars and the Christian forces and the Muslim forces were absolutely huge. But this is not a thing that is completely not happening in the history in other times as well. As well-organized charge of cavalry can completely change the way how the battle is happening and the outcome of the battle. It was also happening in 17th century Poland when winged hussars, the famous formation, was charging. The difference between them and the musketeers of the opposing forces were also huge, and they were winning.
Jafroy is now a battle-hardened warrior. He has earned his blood-red cross many times, and now he has the honor of defending the last Crusader stronghold at the Siege of Acre in 1291.
It's unfortunate, but the two most renowned battles and sieges that are fought by the Templars are both losses. There's the loss of the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the final loss of the Crusades in 1291 at the Siege of Acre. In 1291, they're there because they're pretty much the only ones left. Everybody has left the Holy Land by this time, and it's only those who are most dedicated to holding on to Christendom in the Middle East that stay. And these are this group of Hospitallers and this group of Templars. And they hang on until they are defeated. But having both those defeats gives us a sense that, well, maybe they weren't that good. They were good. They were really good. You need your best people, even at defeat. They protected everybody else who got away from Acre before the Crusades ends in that town in 1291.
For Jafroy, it would be better to die in battle than to live to a comfortable old age, if it meant seeing the terrible downfall of the Templars. For almost 200 years, the Templars operated above the law of the land, owing allegiance to no king. Only the Pope could command them. But the fact is, once the Crusaders left the Holy Land for good in 1292, nobody wanted the Templars carving out their own kingdom in Christendom. On the orders of the French king, and sanctioned by the Pope, the Templars in France were arrested on Friday the 13th of October 1307. Templar knights were tortured to extract confessions and burned at the stake. But it was said their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was defiant to the last. Even as the flames consumed him, he shouted those responsible would soon die. And within less than a year, both the king and the pope were dead.
Templar Knights are definitely something that will be, I think, for all the time remembered in the history of warriors. Knights themselves, fighters on the horseback, and monks at the same time. They were serving the god with their strength and with their faith, and they were all the time fighting for the name of the god.
Although Jafroy's deeds never made it to the history books, his courage and the courage of his fellow Templars saved thousands of lives retreating from the Holy Land. They completed their mission, ensuring them their place in heaven. Few military orders were more brutal than was the order stamping out the Templar Knights. After the death of Jafroy the Templar, and for the next 300 years, armored knights would continue to dominate European battlefields. But eventually, in the face of ever greater numbers of infantry, mounted knights became obsolete. Gunpowder spelled the end for those wearing plate armor. To say the least, the causes for which these mounted soldiers fought so valiantly may be out of date. But for one young man in the 13th century, they were all the meaning he needed. His was the warrior's way.